It started like any other fall weekend. Crisp air, golden leaves, and the sound of wildlife echoing through the trees on the edge of my property. I'd been living in this HOA-managed neighborhood for just over a year, drawn in by the picturesque setting, spacious lots, and quiet, wooded boundaries that promised both privacy and a connection to nature. What I didn't realize at the time was just how deeply the HOA's control ran, or how arbitrary and overreaching their rules could become when they decided to make an example of someone. I've been a licensed hunter for over a decade. I grew up in a family that respected nature, followed the rules, and only hunted ethically and legally. My property bordered a stretch of undeveloped land that I was told was part of a conservation easement. But I checked the maps, reviewed my deed, and made absolutely certain that my tree stand, feeders, and trail cams were all well within my private property line. I even double-checked state hunting regulations and made sure my licensing was up to date. There were no restrictions from the state or the county prohibiting me from hunting in that space. As far as I could tell, I was doing everything right. It didn't take long before I found out that doing everything right wasn't enough in this neighborhood. A week after my first hunting weekend on the property, I received a letter from the HOA. The tone was cold, clipped, and laced with passive-aggressive formality. According to the letter, I had violated Section 8.3b of the HOA Community Covenant, which prohibited the discharge of firearms or weapons within neighborhood boundaries. It didn't matter that I used a compound bow. It didn't matter that I wasn't near any trails, homes, or common areas. They simply interpreted my bow hunting as a weapon discharge, and I was hit with a $500 fine and a formal warning. I was stunned, not just by the fine, but by the sheer audacity of it. I called the HOA office for clarification, thinking it had to be a mistake. The woman on the other end of the line was polite but firm. She said hunting was a safety concern, regardless of legality or location, and that multiple residents had complained. I asked who, but of course, that information was confidential. I asked if I could attend the next board meeting to contest the fine, and I was told I could, but that the board had full discretion over enforcement and that fines were rarely reversed once assessed. I showed up at that meeting anyway. I came prepared with maps, documents, legal printouts, even a copy of my hunting license. I explained that I had taken every precaution, stayed within my rights, and ensured no threat or nuisance to the neighborhood. They listened, nodded, and then voted 4-1 to uphold the fine. One board member, a retired lawyer, tried to argue that their covenant wording was too vague and open to legal challenge, but he was overruled. The president of the HOA told me that this isn't just about legality, it's about the kind of community we want to be. The kind of community they wanted to be, apparently, was one where the board could interpret the rules however they liked and enforce them selectively. Word spread fast after that meeting. Neighbors who once waved at me now looked away. A few stopped by to tell me they understood and thought the HOA was overreaching, but none wanted to say so publicly. One neighbor told me, in hushed tones, that the president of the HOA had been trying to push a stricter code of conduct around land use for years, and that my hunting had given her just the opening she needed. The fine itself wasn't financially devastating, but it was infuriating. Not because of the money, but because of what it represented, an assertion of power over something that shouldn't have been in their jurisdiction to begin with. It was the principle of the thing. I own that land. I followed the law. And they were trying to make me feel like I was the one out of line. I could have let it go, paid the fine, moved on, and just stopped hunting. But something about the way they handled it, the smugness, the certainty that I wouldn't fight back, sparked something in me. They wanted control, and they expected compliance. What they didn't expect was resistance. After that board meeting, I couldn't let it go. The more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't just about the fine or the so-called weapon discharge. It was about control. The HOA believed they had the final say in everything, including what I did on land I paid for, maintained, and lived on. If they were willing to twist vague rules into fines, what would stop them from escalating the next time? That's when I started digging, not out of spite, at least not at first, but out of curiosity and a need to understand the boundaries of their authority versus mine. My lot backed up to a large stretch of wooded terrain. When I bought the house, the real estate agent had casually mentioned that it bordered conservation land, but nothing specific was said about its ownership. I was under the impression it was protected greenbelt or possibly municipal land. But in the days after the fine, I went to the county recorder's office to pull the plat maps and property records for the surrounding area. I wanted to know exactly who owned what. That's when I made the first surprising discovery. A significant portion of the wooded area behind my lot, including some of the trails used by residents for hiking and dog walking, wasn't owned by the city or the state. It was actually deeded to the HOA itself, listed as community natural space in their corporate filings. This chunk of land, about 17 acres, was officially designated for community recreational use, maintained by HOA dues, but technically under the direct ownership of the HOA corporation. The trails I'd seen people use over the past year were informal, mostly dirt paths carved out over time. They weren't paved or even marked, and there were no official signs designating public access. I'd always assumed they were part of a public trail system, but the documents showed they were part of this HOA-owned parcel, land set aside decades ago when the developer established the community. I started asking around quietly, posing as someone interested in conservation and local trails. A friend of mine who works in environmental consulting helped me access the original development plans. It turned out that the HOA had inherited the land from the developer after the final phase of home construction. There was no conservation easement on file, no formal protection in place, just vague language in the bylaws referring to it as a shared asset for the enjoyment of all residents. The kicker? The HOA was allowed, under its own articles, to sell off or repurpose land with a majority board vote and 67% homeowner approval. In other words, the land wasn't locked down the way most people assumed. That got me thinking, if they had the power to sell it, maybe someone could buy it. I checked the tax rolls and found something else interesting. The HOA was paying minimal taxes on that land because it was classified as open space with no improvements. That meant that, from a financial standpoint, it was more of a liability than an asset. It required upkeep, insurance, and regular inspections to satisfy their own policies. If someone came along with a cash offer, I suspected they might consider it, especially if that offer came at the right time, say during budget shortfalls or leadership changes. The more I dug, the more I realized how underutilized and overlooked this land really was. Residents assumed it was sacred ground, but in reality, it was a financial and logistical headache for the board. I began imagining scenarios. What if I could somehow acquire the land? Not out of revenge, at least not entirely, but to protect my space from further interference. If I could control the land behind me, no one could claim that my hunting or any other use was putting others at risk. I could create a buffer between myself and the HOA's reach. But I knew that buying it outright under my name would never work. The board already saw me as a problem. They'd never approve a sale to someone they viewed as disruptive. I needed a workaround, a way to acquire the land without tipping my hand. I began looking into setting up a legal entity, something that could operate independently, file the right paperwork, and keep my name out of the early stages. I started researching LLC structures, land trusts, and real estate holding companies. I spoke with a real estate attorney in another county to keep things discreet. Every step I'd uncovered more evidence of how vulnerable the HOA's prized natural space really was. Their bylaws gave them authority, yes, but also exposed them to certain kinds of legal and financial pressure. They assumed no one would ever challenge them, let alone outmaneuver them at their own game. That assumption was their weakness. Once I understood that the land behind my property wasn't protected in any legal or environmental sense, and that the HOA technically owned it outright, I knew there was an opportunity. But opportunity meant nothing without precision. If I was going to pursue this, I needed to be absolutely sure about every detail. This couldn't be about emotion or impulse. It had to be about cold facts, airtight paperwork, and a strategy that would stand up under scrutiny. That's when I dove headfirst into researching legal loopholes and land ownership structures, not just from a homeowner's perspective, but from that of a developer, a corporate entity, even a nonprofit. I began spending evenings poring over county land records, public deed filings, and the HOA's own meeting minutes, which I was entitled to request as a member of the association. I looked through years of archived records and minutes, and what I found was a pattern. The HOA board rarely discussed the land in detail. There was no formal management plan, no structured long-term budget for trail upkeep, no restrictions or protections on development. In fact, one meeting from 6 years prior even mentioned a motion to consider leasing part of the land for a cell tower, though it never advanced past discussion. That showed me the board was open, at least in principle, to monetizing that land if the right proposal came along. But the legal framework had to be right. I didn't want this move to be seen as a personal vendetta. That would stir up too much resistance, and I suspected the board would go into defense mode. So I started researching how investors and developers acquired land through intermediaries. The first step was setting up a limited liability company. I filed the paperwork in a neighboring state known for its strong privacy protections for LLC owners. That way, my name wouldn't be tied directly to the entity, at least not in any public-facing documentation. I gave the LLC a neutral name, something that sounded like a conservation group or rural development firm. I registered a P.O. box, got a business phone number, and opened a bank account under the company name. Next, I needed to understand exactly what leverage the HOA had and how much power the board could exercise unilaterally. I combed through the HOA's governing documents, the Articles of Incorporation, the CC and RS, the bylaws. I found the clause that allowed land sales, and I noted the exact thresholds, a majority board vote and a two-thirds majority of homeowner approval. At first, that seemed like a deal-breaker, but then I discovered an exception buried in a supplemental section of the bylaws. If the board deemed any portion of common land as non-essential to the character, safety, or function of the community, and if the appraised value fell below a certain threshold, they had the authority to initiate a private sale without a full community vote, as long as it was for non-commercial use. That clause was key. It meant that if the land was positioned as unused or burdensome, and if the buyer proposed something that didn't appear commercial, say, a conservation project or wildlife sanctuary, it might qualify for board-only approval. Suddenly, the path was clear. I hired a property attorney under the name of the LLC and had him draft a letter of interest to the HOA board. It was formal, courteous, and deliberately vague. It stated that the LLC was looking to acquire wooded parcels of land in the region for conservation and low-impact stewardship, and had identified a potential opportunity within the HOA boundaries. The offer was modest but fair enough to make the board take notice, but not high enough to raise suspicion or make it seem like a high-stakes commercial play. I instructed the attorney to include language about assuming liability, relieving the HOA of maintenance obligations, and preserving the natural condition of the space. The pitch wasn't emotional. It was logical. They'd be offloading liability, getting a quick infusion of cash, and retaining plausible deniability if any residents complained. After all, it would be a private sale. The board could argue that they acted in the best fiscal interest of the community, that the land wasn't being developed or paved over, and that they were simply shifting responsibility to an entity that seemed to have good intentions. I even went a step further and drafted mock conservation signage and land use plans, just in case they wanted more visuals. But I wasn't naive. I knew there was a chance someone might connect the dots eventually. So I worked to cover my tracks. I made sure the LLC had no digital footprint that led back to me. I refrained from discussing the plan with anyone locally. I continued attending HOA meetings, playing the role of the calm, rule-abiding homeowner. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, every document I gathered and every legal clause I dissected brought me closer to my goal. Once the groundwork was set and the board had received the formal letter of interest from the LLC, it was just a matter of time. The president brought it up in a board meeting about 2 weeks later. I was sitting there, pretending to hear about it for the first time. She read the offer aloud, emphasizing that the proposal was from a private conservation entity that was looking to acquire underused land for the purpose of preserving its natural state. The tone of the discussion was cautious but intrigued. A few board members asked whether this would lead to any backlash from residents, but the president pointed out that the land in question hadn't been formally developed, didn't generate revenue, and posed long-term maintenance concerns. They didn't vote that night, but it was clear they were seriously considering it. Over the next few weeks, I saw subtle signals that the deal was progressing. There was an executive session added to the next board meeting agenda, closed to the public. Shortly after that, the board posted a notice to the community that they were reviewing proposals to optimize underutilized common assets. The language was vague, intentionally so, but I recognized it as a quiet step toward approval. Meanwhile, I had my attorney draft a purchase agreement with contingencies, and the LLC arranged a certified appraisal of the land. The value came back surprisingly low, largely because of the lack of access roads, utilities, or zoning for development. That worked in my favor. The board would be more likely to sell if the land seemed like a burden rather than an opportunity. The attorney included conditions in the agreement that aligned with the HOA's rules: no commercial development, no subdivision, and minimal environmental impact. These conditions were there to reinforce the conservation narrative, but they also served a dual purpose. I wanted the land untouched. I didn't need to build on it. I just needed control. Within 6 weeks of the initial contact, the board held a special vote. Because the land fell under the threshold set in the bylaws and was deemed non-essential to the community's function, they didn't need a full resident vote. The motion passed with a 3-2 majority. The sale was approved, pending final documentation and title transfer. Less than a week after that, my LLC wired the payment and submitted all the final paperwork. The property changed hands quietly. There was no announcement in the newsletter, no press release, no neighborhood meeting. The only official note was a one-line update buried in the monthly board meeting summary: sale of common parcel number 7 finalized. It was done. The LLC I created now legally owned the wooded parcel that ran directly behind my home and extended far enough to include the unmarked trails many residents still believed were part of public conservation land. I received the deed in the mail, along with the final title insurance documents. The property was mine, or at least mine by proxy. No one in the neighborhood had any idea I was behind the transaction. From their perspective, a quiet conservation group had acquired the land for preservation purposes, and the HOA had successfully rid itself of a minor financial liability. The first thing I did was order a full survey of the property. I wanted precise boundaries mapped out, with permanent markers installed at each corner. I hired a local surveyor, someone from out of town, just to reduce gossip, and had them record the results with the county. That gave me a detailed visual of everything I now owned. The second thing I did was install signage, small, wooden posts with a modest message: private property, no trespassing, protected habitat area. The signs were discreet but firm. There were no barbed wire fences, no cameras, no confrontational tone. Just a quiet, legal barrier telling people they no longer had the right to be there. It didn't take long for people to notice. One morning, I watched from my deck as a couple with a golden retriever stopped at the edge of the woods, saw the sign, and turned around. A few days later, someone posted in the neighborhood Facebook group asking if anyone knew what the signs meant. A board member replied vaguely that the land had been transferred to a private conservation group and that residents should respect property lines. That was it. No one questioned it further. I knew I had done something most people wouldn't dare try. Something calculated, technical, and undeniably legal. It had started with a $500 fine and ended with a land acquisition that changed the dynamics of the entire neighborhood. Where others saw HOA rules as walls, I had seen them as a map. All I had to do was read it better than the people who built it. Once the property was legally in the hands of my LLC and that no trespassing signs were in place, I took the next step, revoking all access, implied or otherwise. I didn't want to leave any gray areas, because with HOAs, ambiguity is an invitation for interference. My lawyer and I drafted a formal declaration of private ownership and restricted use, and we recorded it with the county. That document made it clear that no existing easements, trails, or rights-of-way existed across the property. If anyone had been assuming they could walk or hike across that land, those days were over. I also sent a certified letter to the HOA board, not from me personally, but from the LLC's legal counsel. It wasn't aggressive. It simply reiterated the terms of the purchase, reminded them of the private status of the property, and requested their cooperation in notifying residents not to trespass. I made it clear that this was not an offer to negotiate. The board responded with a single-page acknowledgement letter and assured the LLC that it would inform the community accordingly. I had no reason to believe they were thrilled about the arrangement, but legally, they were boxed in. They had sold the land willingly, and there were no reversion clauses, shared use agreements, or easements to fall back on. From a legal standpoint, their hands were tied. Over the next couple of weeks, the effect started to ripple outward. Residents who used to walk the trails behind their homes began running into the new signage. Most complied and turned back, though a few ignored the warnings. I anticipated that. So, without making a public spectacle of it, I installed motion-activated trail cameras in a few strategic spots, just enough to document movement and provide evidence if needed. The cameras weren't hidden, but they also weren't glaringly obvious. They were just visible enough to send a subtle message: someone is watching, and this isn't your space anymore. Sure enough, one of the cameras caught footage of a man and his teenage son walking along one of the old trails. The footage wasn't dramatic, they didn't damage anything, but it was enough for my lawyer to send a carefully worded cease and desist notice to the HOA, not directed at the individuals, but reminding the board of its obligation to discourage unauthorized access. That letter, too, was measured and professional. It referenced liability issues, insurance risk, and property rights, language the HOA understood very well. The real turning point came when a few residents began complaining on the neighborhood Facebook page. Someone posted a blurry photo of one of the signs and asked if anyone knew what happened to the community trails. The responses were mixed. Some people expressed confusion, others annoyance. One or two speculated about a developer buying the land. The HOA finally weighed in with a post that vaguely referenced a change in land ownership and reminded everyone to respect posted signage. That thread quickly became a mess of rumors, blame, and misinformation, and the board ended up locking the comments after it got too heated. Internally, I could sense the growing frustration. The board members probably didn't expect the land sale to generate this much pushback, even if it was from a small group of vocal residents. But they had no recourse. There was no clause in the sales agreement giving them input after the transaction. They couldn't backtrack or undo what they had done without attempting to buy the land back at a premium, something I knew they didn't have the budget or votes to support. I started to receive indirect pressure. A board member stopped me on a walk and casually mentioned that a lot of people miss those trails and wondered if I'd heard anything about the new owners considering community access. I smiled politely and said I wasn't sure. Another neighbor asked if I could put in a good word with the group that bought the land. I deflected and moved on. At no point did I confirm or deny my connection to the LLC. Letting them stew in ambiguity was part of the plan. Meanwhile, I submitted an application to the county to have the property officially reclassified as private open space under stewardship, which allowed for certain tax exemptions. That reclassification strengthened my claim that the land was being preserved, not developed, and gave me legal cover for restricting access. The approval process was mostly administrative, just a matter of submitting a land use affidavit, a property map, and a statement of intent. A few weeks later, the county signed off. Now, not only was the land off limits, but it was officially recognized as such. By this point, the neighborhood had largely adjusted to the change, but tension lingered under the surface. The land, once casually used and assumed to be communal, was now completely out of their reach. No more impromptu dog walks, no shortcut trails, no scenic strolls behind their backyards. What was once a quiet backdrop to their homes had become a boundary, and they had no power to cross it. The psychological shift in the neighborhood was subtle at first. People stopped making eye contact when they passed me on the street. The board members who once waved at HOA meetings now gave me polite nods or looked the other way entirely. Conversations grew more strained, and neighborhood events that used to draw large crowds started thinning out. I could feel the tension like static in the air. People didn't know exactly what I had done, but they knew something had changed, and they didn't like it. The unspoken social contract of the neighborhood had been broken, and the only thing worse than breaking it was doing so with a smile and complete legal authority. There was this myth people liked to tell themselves, that HOA communities were about shared values, harmony, and collective good. But beneath, that was a system built on control, on micromanagement, on the belief that everyone must conform to maintain peace. What I had done wasn't just about land or access. It was a disruption to that control. I had exposed the illusion that the HOA held all the cards. I hadn't broken the rules. I'd followed them more precisely than they ever had. And that was what unsettled them the most. One afternoon, I walked the edge of the property line, inspecting the new markers and ensuring the signs were still upright. I saw a father and his two kids standing near one of the old trailheads, looking in. They weren't trespassing, just standing still, uncertain. The kids asked their dad why they couldn't go into the woods anymore. He didn't have an answer. He just muttered something about new owners and walked away. It hit me in that moment how many people had taken the access for granted, had assumed that the trails were permanent, that the land would always be available because it always had been. No one questioned the ownership until it was gone. Behind closed doors, the HOA must have been seething. I'd given them no reason to act. The land wasn't being developed. I wasn't violating any rules. They couldn't impose fines or site violations because I'd removed their jurisdiction from the equation entirely. The very structure they relied on to enforce compliance was powerless. They had played their hand with the hunting fine, and I had raised them with the deed to their own woods. It wasn't revenge, it was strategy, and they had no move left on the board. The neighborhood newsletter eventually published a short piece titled Clarification on Community Trail Access, which read more like a resignation letter than a clarification. It admitted that previous trail usage was unofficial and that access rights had never been formally granted. It urged residents to respect property boundaries and closed with a line about seeking alternative options for outdoor enjoyment. That was their white flag. They weren't going to fight, because there was no fight to be had. They had sold the land, and with it, their leverage. There were whispers that some residents wanted to organize a petition to buy the land back or negotiate access, but nothing ever materialized. I kept track of the neighborhood group chats anonymously. People speculated, theorized, debated. Some blamed the board, others blamed the new owners, a few even hinted at lawsuits, but those were just empty threats thrown around in frustration. The truth was simple. No one had been paying attention until it was too late. Every now and then, someone would leave a passive-aggressive note near the trailhead sign. One said, "Nature should be shared." Another, "What's the point of community if we fence each other out?" I took them down quietly and filed them away. They were proof that the illusion still held some power over people, that they still believed they were owed access to something they had never truly owned. And while they struggled with that realization, I went about my life in peace. The land, now silent and untouched, became a kind of monument, not just to the fallout between me and the HOA, but to the limits of collective entitlement. What had once been a common backdrop was now a personal boundary, a buffer of trees and trails that belonged solely to me. I'd go out there some mornings, just to walk the paths in solitude. The air was calmer now, unburdened by the footsteps of neighbors or the subtle pressure of shared space. I never had to announce what I'd done. I didn't need to. The board knew. A few savvy residents likely pieced it together over time. But most still saw it as some abstract decision made by a faceless entity, a consequence of bureaucratic missteps or outside buyers. That suited me just fine. Let the myth grow. Let the legend twist. I'd won my space, not by fighting their rules, but by mastering them completely. And once you do that, you don't need to raise your voice. You just close the gates behind you and walk on in silence.